been 1 day since the start of the Third World War. The Sino-Russian alliance has pushed NATO back significantly in the Baltic states as America rushes to recall troops on leave and prepare to embark reinforcements to Europe. It'll take weeks for the US to be ready for ground operations, even with the world's largest logistical fleet preparing around-the-clock flights to Europe. NATO is rushing to marshal a response force in Poland as the Polish military reinforces its defenses on its border with Russia-held Ukraine and Kaliningrad. After a day of fierce fighting, it's not expected that NATO will hold on to its Baltic allies for long, though that was always expected. NATO navies have initiated a sting of anti-submarine defenses that stretch from Greenland to Iceland and to the UK to help safeguard US troop ships as the first rushed reinforcements began to load onto ships on the US East and Gulf coasts. In the Baltic Sea, fierce fighting between NATO ships and the Russian Navy has kept Russian naval firepower at bay. As it has so often found itself throughout history, Russia is unable to put its fleets to sea, outnumbered and outgunned by superior NATO navies. French and Spanish aircraft carriers have moved into the Mediterranean and are steaming toward the Black Sea, where the Turkish Navy has been securing the Bosphorus Strait and cutting it off to Russian trade. From the Black Sea, NATO ships can harass Russia's southern flank with long-range missiles and airstrikes, though they still face stiff defenses based out of Crimea. In the Pacific, the US Navy and Air Force have yet to stage a counterattack against Chinese forces. Ongoing missile attacks have kept the US fleet far out at sea and out of range of launching their own attacks. Losses continue to mount as Chinese land-based missile strikes seek out American ships or sink and cripple them. However, the number of missiles in the Chinese inventory is rapidly diminishing. On Taiwan, the first 2 beach assaults have failed, leading China to cancel their assaults. Over 5,000 Chinese soldiers lie dead on or just off of Taiwan's northern beaches. Chinese air assaults have met with similar failures, but thanks to fierce air support, 2 of the landing sites remain in Chinese control. It's cost the Chinese Air Force dearly, though, with over 50 aircraft destroyed in the first day of fighting alone. Across the island, Chinese special forces inserted secretly onto the island prior to the invasion have struck out at Taiwanese political and military leadership. Several prominent politicians are either under arrest or dead. Efforts to evacuate senior Taiwanese leadership to the mainland, where they can be used for propaganda purposes, have ended in failure, and Taiwan's president remains out of grasp of Chinese kill teams. Rather than allow Taiwan to recapture officials, Chinese special forces execute them. Hour 48. Tankers have been escorting U.S. fighter and bomber aircraft across the Pacific non-stop for the last 2 days. The bulk of the U.S. Air Forces now are stationed in civilian and military airfields across Japan, as the Japanese self-defense forces successfully fend off the worst of China's continued but diminished missile attacks. Losses to U.S. aircraft on the ground remain significant, but enough aircraft are operational to begin offensive operations. The Chinese fleet has reinitiated amphibious assaults against Taiwan under the cover of a vicious air campaign. Most of Taiwan's air defenses have been neutralized by now, including the majority of the Taiwanese Air Force. However, as the assault commences, Chinese airborne radar detects a massive air assault of F-15 and F-18s, backed up with multiple tankers and EWACs for support. The F-18s have been launched from the surviving Pacific Fleet carriers and ferried to their destination with the support of drone tankers. The U.S. Air Force's F-15s have been flying for hours from Japanese air bases, accompanied by their Japanese allies. The U.S. and Japanese tanker fleet has remained in orbit around the seas south of Japan, topping off the massive air fleet and ready to help fuel-starved combatants return home. The largest air battle of modern war is about to begin. Chinese interceptors move to defend the amphibious assault from both the northern and eastern air assault. China's lack of aircraft carriers forces the fighters to remain close to Taiwan's shore, which exposes them to surviving air defense units, forcing the Chinese to turn on afterburners and try to meet the American and Japanese forces out at sea. There's another reason for trying to close the distance as rapidly as possible, and it becomes apparent as the first missile lock warnings ring out across the cockpits of Chinese fighters. Stealthy F-22s and F-35s are leading the assault, launching new-generation long-range air-to-air missiles at the Chinese jets. The result is dramatic, as Chinese fighters are forced to dive to try to juke off the American missiles. With 2 missiles fired at each hostile, many Chinese fighters fail to shake off the missiles and are splashed. But stealth fighters have one inherent weakness. They have a very low missile capacity due to the need to carry all weapons internally. Spent even before making visual contact, the F-22s are forced to turn around, but the F-35s press the attack. Their data link capabilities allow them to guide non-stealthy fighter weapons to targets, while keeping the vulnerable 4th-generation fighters away from the enemy jets. Another wave of missiles scream across the sky guided by F-35s that the Chinese are having difficulty picking up on radar. But the Chinese have an improved air-to-air missile with a range in excess of 200 miles, and they launched their own volleys back at the Americans and Japanese. They can't target the F-35s yet, but the F-18s and F-15s give off massive radar returns and are easy prey for the improved Chinese missiles. Friendly aircraft tumble out of the sky as the Chinese press individual range of the attack. The F-35s immediately break off. They're not built for close-quarters combat. The F-15s and F-18s, however, are. Chinese J-10s, J-16s, and Su-30s are fine aircraft, but the F-15 Fighting Eagle has proven it is the superior machine in conflicts around the world. For every F-15 downed, 4 enemy aircraft are splashed. The battle is far from decisive, but American and Japanese strike aircraft are able to penetrate Chinese air cover and deliver devastating blows to the assembled Chinese fleet. Air defenses have a difficult time taking out the attacking aircraft thanks to their use of long-range standoff attack munitions. Missile defenses, however, do their best to fend off the attack and succeed with a kill rate of about 60%. But many Chinese ships are still struck and either sunk or rendered combat ineffective. By the end of the second day of fighting, America has finally struck back in an inconclusive air battle that saw both sides take steep losses. Its fleet of stealthy F-22s and F-35s, however, remains largely intact, but it's feared that there are simply too few to carry on the fight. Conspicuously, China's Chengdu J-20 has yet to make an appearance on the battlefield. Despite the setback in the air, China has managed to secure a beachhead on Taiwan. Now the unloading of the massive Chinese army can begin, but Taiwanese resistance is far from broken. Over in Europe, NATO forces in the Baltic states are exhausted and overwhelmed, with many surrendering to the Russians. It'll be a few days yet, but Russia is on the verge of reclaiming lost Soviet territories. However, the war is far from over, and NATO will quickly be capable of launching massive ground assaults against Russia, starting with Kaliningrad. Hour 72. Fierce fighting rages on in the major cities of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, but NATO's 40,000-strong response force has been neutralized by Russian forces. The cost has been steep, but with conventional forces largely defeated in the Baltics, the massive Russian war machine begins to swing south towards Kaliningrad, which has been decimated by ongoing missile attacks. The battle for the heart of Europe will commence in days, as NATO uses Poland as a staging ground for its counterattack. In the Pacific, U.S. losses of ships and aircraft are steep, and additional material from the U.S.'s other global commands is being rushed to the Pacific. However, Chinese losses are even steeper. In a race of attrition, China will ultimately lose. Hence, it's vital that Taiwan be captured as quickly as possible. U.S. forces, however, have begun a naval blockade of China, cutting it off from its naval trade routes. Sensing an opportunity to seriously weaken its regional rival, India joins in the blockade, sealing China off from importing the oil and natural gas it desperately needs. Land supply routes to Russia are still available, but the steep drop in supply causes energy prices to skyrocket. Like Russia discovered in Ukraine, Taiwanese resistance to hostile invaders is stiff and deadly. Chinese troops are engaged in fierce street fighting, with civilian militias taking up arms provided by the government against the invaders. The Taiwanese people have no desire to be a part of Xi Jinping's China, and they make the People's Liberation Army pay dearly for every inch of Taiwan they take. Hour 168. Across Chinese social media, images of the ghastly cost of the Taiwan invasion are being spread. Taiwanese and American cyber warfare agents have managed to penetrate the Chinese Great Firewall, and now photos and videos of the devastation in Taiwan are being spread faster than Chinese censors can stop it. The Chinese people have for generations been told that a conquest of Taiwan would be easy and bloodless, but the high cost in terms of human lives is now clear for all of China to see. The Chinese Communist Party has used the state media apparatus to lie about casualty figures, reporting only a trickle of casualties each day, hoping to keep the public outrage down. Anger and outrage quickly builds. In Europe, NATO's second response force has engaged Russian forces across the length of the Polish border. Russian air defense batteries have been greatly attrited through ongoing strikes against them, but the cost has been high for the pilots of Europe's air forces. American stealth aircraft are badly needed in the Pacific, and the job of suppressing Russian air defenses falls on Europe's largely non-stealth air force. The outcome of World War III will be decided in Poland and Taiwan. Hour 336. 2 weeks after the start of World War III, the momentum of the Russian war machine has begun to stall out in light of stiff and well-organized resistance by NATO forces. The invasion of Ukraine has proven that the much-feared Russian military juggernaut is a clumsy giant, defeated more by its own ineptitude than foreign military powers. While Western armies place a strong emphasis on logistics, Russian military forces have approximately 25% the logistics personnel of NATO militaries. This means massive convoys of Russian vehicles stuck on the side of roads and highways, starved of fuel and ammunition. Russian troops, especially its conscript force, is suffering from catastrophically low morale as they come under fire from advanced NATO weapons systems. Surrenders of entire units are growing increasingly common, and the high casualties are causing a massive political dissent back home. Strong-handed police tactics against anti-war protesters can barely restrain the tide of malcontent sweeping across Russia, and Vladimir Putin's hold on power grows more tenuous by the day. While the Russian attack hasn't been repelled, it has been ground to a halt just inside Poland's borders. The arrival of a large American army unit on the continent marks the beginning of offensive operations for NATO, and the future looks grim for a Russian military suffering from bad equipment, low morale, and terrible logistics. The Russian Air Force, however, continues to perform well, though equipment and maintenance shortfalls have begun affecting it as well. Slowly but surely, European NATO forces have wrestled control of the skies away from Russia, and over the coming day, Russian frontline units will be exposed to the full wrath of NATO air support. In the Pacific, China has maintained its hold on the western half of Taiwan, but at a staggering cost. Over 15,000 Chinese troops are dead or wounded, but the Chinese Communist Party works hard to keep those figures hidden from an increasingly angry Chinese public. They were promised a swift victory over the tiny island, and that the United States could be defeated in the Pacific with China's advanced missiles and aircraft. Neither of these have proven true, and while the US has suffered massive losses of ships and planes, it's able to replenish losses faster than the Chinese Navy and Air Force. Taiwan's defenders have so far repelled China's attempts to push through the east of the island, and now American Marines are arriving in force. To the world's great surprise, US Marines are backed up by Japanese troops, who have revoked their pacifist constitution in the name of regional defense against an aggressive China. But it's not just the Japanese joining the US in defending Taiwan, as the Australians join America in defense of the Pacific. China alone in the region with no friends is now facing the monumental task of defeating three major powers simultaneously. As losses mount for the Sino-Russian alliance, both Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin consider their final option. Nuclear power is the great equalizer, and the one way.
Thanks you for watching. Please like and subscribe my channel, The World